Welcome, travelers, to another cozy evening with Snug as a Bug. Tonight, we embark on a journey through ancient Europe, where acts of courage shaped history. Get ready to experience 3 thrilling adventures from the past. First, we travel to ancient Britain, where Boudica, the fearless warrior queen, rises against the might of the Roman Empire. Leading daring raids and fierce battles, Boudica rallies her people to resist the invaders who have taken her land and family. Her unyielding determination and courage make for an unforgettable tale of defiance. Next, we head to Alesia, where Vercingetorix, the proud leader of the Gauls, stands against Julius Caesar. Despite being surrounded by Roman forces, Vercingetorix employs bold strategies to protect his people and challenge his formidable opponent. This story is one of clever tactics, fierce battles, and the indomitable spirit of the Gauls. Finally, we venture into the ancient forests of Europe, where mystical Druids use the forces of nature to defend their sacred lands. The Romans, confident in their strength, find themselves up against powerful magic and enchanted woods. This adventure is filled with mysterious rituals, ancient spells, and the fierce defense of the sacred groves. Let these ancient tales guide you gently into a place of peace, as the soft sounds of this historical world carry you closer to sleep. But before we begin, close your eyes and let yourself drift to the edge of a vast, ancient landscape. Before you stretches the boundless land of Britain, where rolling hills and deep forests embrace the horizon, and across the channel lies the mystic realm of Gaul. The twilight sky above glows in shades of deep, velvety blue, scattered with countless stars twinkling like the dreams of those who've walked here before. Breathe in the cool night air, tinged with the earthy scent of wild herbs, rosemary and thyme, mingling with the fresh dewdrops settling on the grass. Ahead, clusters of glowing campfires dot the landscape like beacons of hope and unity, each flame a quiet testament to the courage of those gathered here. Around the fires, you hear soft murmurs, quiet prayers, the rustle of armor, and the hum of something ancient and powerful coursing through the earth beneath you. Feel a calm, quiet resolve settle deep within your heart, as if you, too, belong to this time, connected across centuries to the lives and spirits that shaped these lands. Let this feeling wrap around you, a cloak of gentle strength, as whispers of history begin to rise like the soft murmur of a distant sea, guiding you into the first of these ancient tales. Now, dear traveler, you stand on the brink of an unforgettable journey. Let your mind relax and open to the wonders that lie within these epic tales. The Capture of Boudica. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, stood atop a low hill, her piercing gaze fixed on the horizon. The early morning sun bathed her crimson hair in a fiery glow, and her cloak of dark blue wool fluttered in the breeze. Around her, her people gathered, warriors, farmers, women, and children, all with eyes filled with determination and fear. The Romans had pushed them too far, and now it was time to fight back. The quiet resolve in their eyes spoke of a people who had suffered greatly but had not been broken. They were united by a shared purpose, bound by the injustice they had endured, and their hearts burned with the fire of rebellion. Boudica turned to her commanders, her eyes fierce. "We have endured enough," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Our people have suffered, and our lands have been stolen. We will not submit any longer. We fight for our children, for our ancestors, and for our freedom. Are you with me?" Selin, one of her most trusted warriors, nodded, his eyes blazing. "To the end, my queen," he said. "We fight for all that is dear to us." Boudica's daughters, Eliana and Mylis, stood beside her, their young faces hardened by what they had seen. Eliana spoke, her voice determined. We will fight, mother! We will not let their cruelty go unanswered." Boudica smiled, pride swelling in her heart. "Then we fight together," she said, "for the Iceni, for Britannia." Boudica's husband, Presutagus, had once walked the uneasy line between submission and rebellion, choosing to ally himself with Rome to protect his people. He had hoped that by cooperating, he could shield the Iceni from the worst of Roman aggression. But when he died, everything changed. The Romans, ignoring his wishes, had seized the Iceni lands, plundering their treasures and treating the people with brutal cruelty. Boudica herself had been scourged, and her daughters violated, their cries echoing in the hearts of the Iceni, igniting a fire that would not be quenched. The time for peace had passed. Only defiance remained. She raised her spear high, her voice echoing through the hills as she called out to her people. "We will not kneel," she cried. "We fight not for conquest, but for freedom, for our children, for our ancestors who rest beneath these hills." Her voice carried with it the weight of generations, the dreams of those who had come before, and the hopes of those who would come after. She looked into the eyes of her people, seeing the reflections of her own determination, and she knew that this was a moment that would be remembered for centuries. The people roared in response, their voices rising as one, a chorus of fury and hope. The sound carried across the land, rippling through the grasslands and disturbing the crows perched on ancient oaks. It was as if the land itself responded to their cry, the wind rising to carry their defiance far and wide. The storm was gathering, and the Romans would soon learn the price of their arrogance. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the soul of Britannia. Boudica's heart swelled with pride as she looked upon her people, each of them ready to sacrifice everything for the freedom of their homeland. Chapter 2. The Flames of Rebellion. Boudica led her people with the strength of a lioness, her chariot tearing across the fields of Britannia, her daughters standing beside her as symbols of resilience and unbroken spirit. Her eyes burned with a fierce light, and her presence alone seemed to inspire those around her. Her army grew with every village she passed, men and women alike taking up whatever weapons they could find, spears, clubs, even farming tools. They moved like a wave, their anger giving them strength, their love for their homeland giving them courage. The air was thick with the scent of determination and the promise of vengeance. As they reached the outskirts of Camulodunum, Boudica halted her chariot and turned to her warriors. "Look upon this place," she said, her voice carrying over the gathered crowd. "This was once our land, our sacred ground, and the Romans have desecrated it with their arrogance. Today we reclaim what is ours. Let the flames of our rebellion burn bright, and let them know that we will not be silenced." Era, a fierce warrior who had fought beside Boudica since the beginning, stepped forward. "We fight for our families, for those they have wronged," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We will make them pay for every injustice." Boudica nodded, her eyes meeting those of her people. "Together we will show them the power of a people united," she said. "Let us remind them that Britannia belongs to us." They struck swiftly and without mercy, laying waste to the Roman settlements of Camulodunum and Londinium. Flames roared into the sky as the cities were reduced to ash. The Roman oppressors fled before them, and for a time it seemed as though Boudica's rebellion might succeed. Her warriors cheered her name, and the people spoke of her as a goddess of war, the embodiment of Britannia's untamed spirit. The streets of the Roman settlements ran red, and the air was filled with the acrid scent of smoke and vengeance. The cries of the fleeing Romans echoed through the night, and for a brief moment Boudica allowed herself to believe that they might truly be free. But even as the fires of rebellion burned bright, shadows loomed on the horizon. The Romans were regrouping, gathering their legions to strike back with cold precision. They were led by the cunning governor, Suetonius Paulinus, a man who knew that the strength of Rome lay in its discipline, its unwavering order. He had no illusions about the difficulty of the task before him, but he also knew that the Roman legions were trained to face such challenges without fear or hesitation. He would crush this rebellion just as Rome had crushed so many before. Boudica's spies brought word of the Roman preparations, and the queen knew the time for celebration was over. She gathered her people, her voice steady and filled with purpose. "We have struck a blow against our oppressors, but this fight is far from over. The Romans come for us, and we must be ready to meet them. We fight not only for ourselves, but for every village, every child, every sacred grove that Rome seeks to destroy." Her words filled her people with renewed determination, their eyes glinting with the light of defiance. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but they were ready to face whatever came. The spirit of Britannia was not easily broken. Chapter 3. The Clash at Watling Street. The two forces met at Watling Street, a narrow valley flanked by dense woods. Boudica's warriors vastly outnumbered the Romans, but the Romans had chosen their ground well. They stood in a tight formation, shields locked, spears at the ready, a wall of iron that seemed unbreakable. The valley was eerily quiet. The only sound, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, as if nature itself held its breath. The tension in the air was palpable, and even the birds had fallen silent, sensing the impending clash. Boudica rode along the lines of her people, her voice ringing out above the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded. "This is our land!" she shouted. "We fight for our freedom, for our children, and for the spirits of our ancestors." Her people roared in response, their voices echoing through the valley. It was a moment that seemed to transcend time, the echoes of countless generations joining their cries. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble with the weight of their resolve, and the air was charged with the energy of their defiance. Boudica turned to her daughters, her voice softening. "Maelis, Aeliana, stay close to me," she said. "Today we show them our strength. Today we fight as one." Maelis nodded, her face set in determination. "We will not let them break us, mother," she said. "We fight for all that we are." Boudica's eyes glistened with pride. "Yes, my brave ones," she said. "No matter what happens, remember that we fight for our people, for our land, and for the freedom of our souls." The Iceni charged, their fury driving them forward like a raging storm. They crashed against the Roman lines, but the disciplined legionnaires held their ground. Again and again, the Britons surged forward, but the Romans did not break. The narrow valley worked against the Iceni, their numbers becoming a hindrance as they struggled to maneuver. The Romans, with their superior tactics and armor, began to push forward, their shields forming an impenetrable wall. The clash of metal and the cries of battle filled the air, a cacophony of chaos that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Boudica fought at the front, her spear flashing in the sunlight, her voice urging her people on. Her daughters fought beside her, their faces set in grim determination. But as the hours wore on, it became clear that the tide was turning against them. The Romans, relentless and methodical, began to cut down the Britons, their disciplined ranks advancing step by step. The cries of the wounded filled the air, and the once hopeful charge began to falter. The ground beneath them was slick with blood, and the weight of exhaustion began to press down on them. The valley became a place of chaos. The ground littered with the fallen, the air thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. Boudica's heart pounded as she saw her warriors begin to fall back, their courage waning in the face of the Roman onslaught. She knew that they could not hold much longer, that the dream of freedom was slipping away from them, yet she refused to give in to despair. She fought on, her voice hoarse from shouting, her body aching from the strain of battle. The faces of her daughters beside her, their unwavering resolve, gave her the strength to continue, even as hope began to fade. Chapter 4. The Fall of the Warrior Queen. Boudica knew the battle was lost, but she refused to be captured. She would not allow herself to be paraded through the streets of Rome as a trophy, her spirit broken for the amusement of her enemies. She gathered her daughters close, their faces pale but determined. Together they fled the battlefield, the cries of their people echoing in their ears, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The sound of the Roman advance grew fainter as they rode, but the weight of defeat was heavy on Boudica's heart. Eliana looked up at her mother, her voice trembling. "What will happen to our people, mother?" she asked. Boudica clenched her jaw, her eyes filled with pain. "They will carry on," she said. "The Romans may take our land, but they will never take our spirit. We have given them something they will never forget." Milas wiped her tears, her voice resolute. "We will be remembered, won't we? Our fight will not be in vain." Boudica pulled her daughters closer, her voice breaking. "Yes, my loves," she whispered. "Our fight will live on in the hearts of our people. We may fall today, but our spirit will never die." At dawn, they stopped by a quiet glade, the air still and heavy with the scent of earth and pine. Boudica dismounted, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She looked at her daughters, their eyes filled with tears, and she knew what she had to do. She could not allow them to fall into Roman hands. She could not let their spirits be crushed by the chains of the empire. She embraced them, holding them close, her heart breaking at the thought of what was to come. With a heavy heart, Boudica took the vial of poison she had carried with her, a gift from a Druid who had foreseen this day. She held her daughters close, her voice breaking as she whispered to them, "We are free, my loves. No Roman will ever own us." Together they drank the poison, their bodies sinking to the forest floor, their spirits soaring free. The wind rustled through the trees as if the forest itself was mourning their passing, and the first light of dawn bathed them in a gentle glow, a final blessing from the land they had fought to protect. The birds began to sing, their song a mournful tribute to the fallen queen and her daughters, and the glade seemed to hold its breath, honoring their sacrifice. Chapter 5. The Legacy of Boudica. The Romans found them there, lying beneath the ancient oaks, their faces peaceful in death. Suetonius Paullinus stood over them, his face a mask of stone. He knew that though Boudica was gone, her spirit would live on. The rebellion had been crushed, but the Britons would never be truly conquered. The land itself seemed to mourn her loss, the wind whispering her name through the trees, the earth holding her memory within its depths. The sun shone down upon them, casting a warm glow over their still forms, as if the land itself sought to protect them, even in death. One of Suetonius's captains approached, his voice low. "The queen is dead, governor. What shall we do with the bodies?" Suetonius paused, his gaze fixed on Boudica. "Leave them," he said. "Let the people see their queen one last time. Let them remember her courage." The captain hesitated, then nodded. "They will remember her, governor. She fought until the very end." Suetonius turned away, his face unreadable. "Yes," he said quietly, "and that is what makes her dangerous, even in death." And so, the story of Boudica, the warrior queen who defied Rome, became a legend. Her courage, her love for her people, and her unbroken spirit would be remembered for generations. Her name would be whispered by the fireside, her story told to children as they drifted off to sleep. A reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, the human spirit can remain unbroken. Her defiance would inspire others, her sacrifice a beacon of hope for those who face the tyranny of Rome in the years to come. The people of Britannia would remember her as the embodiment of their resistance, a symbol of the unyielding strength that lay within them all. The Siege of Alesia, Vercingetorix versus Caesar. Chapter 1. The Leader of Gaul. Vercingetorix stood on the battlements of Alesia, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Roman encampment stretched out below, an endless mass of tents, soldiers, and siege weapons. His heart pounded, but his face remained calm, his expression resolute. He knew that this was the last stand for the Gauls. The tribes had come together, united under his leadership, and now they would either triumph or fall together. His second in command, Druid, approached, his brow furrowed with concern. "The Romans are preparing their siege lines, Vercingetorix," he said, his voice low. "Their numbers are overwhelming. Do we have enough supplies to outlast them?" Vercingetorix turned to face his friend, his eyes fierce. "We have more than supplies, Druid," he replied. "We have our people, our courage, and our knowledge of this land. Caesar may have his legions, but we have the spirit of Gaul. We fight for our freedom, for our children, and for the memory of those who have already fallen." Druid nodded, though the worry did not leave his eyes. "The tribes are with you, my lord. They trust in your leadership, but Caesar is relentless. He will not stop until he has crushed us." Vercingetorix placed a hand on Druid's shoulder. "Then let him come. We will make him pay dearly for every step he takes. We have fought too long and lost too much to give in now. We will show Caesar that the spirit of Gaul cannot be broken." As the sun began to set, Vercingetorix looked out over the hills, the distant fires of the Roman camp flickering like stars on the ground. He knew that the days ahead would test them all, that the odds were against them, but he also knew that they could not afford to falter. The fate of Gaul rested on his shoulders, and he would not let his people down. He turned back to Druid, his voice steady. "Gather the commanders. Tonight we plan our defenses. We must be ready for whatever Caesar throws at us. Every rock, every tree, every inch of this land is ours, and we will use it to our advantage." Druid's eyes lit with determination. "Yes, my lord, the men will be ready." Vercingetorix nodded, his gaze returning to the horizon. "Good. We fight not just for ourselves, but for every tribe that has suffered under Rome's yoke. We will show them that Gaul is not theirs to take." As night fell, the commanders gathered in a small, dimly lit room within Alesia. The air was thick with tension, and the flickering torchlight cast long shadows on the walls. Vercingetorix stood at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the faces of his trusted warriors. They were weary, but their resolve remained unbroken. "We must use every advantage we have," Vercingetorix began, his voice steady. "The Romans are disciplined, but they do not know this land as we do. We will use the terrain to our advantage. We will strike at their supply lines, harass their foraging parties, and make them pay for every inch they try to take." One of the commanders, a grizzled veteran named Caradoc, spoke up. "The people are scared, my lord. They fear the Romans will breach the walls." Vercingetorix met Caradoc's gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "They have every right to be scared, but fear can be a powerful ally. It can drive us to fight harder, to protect what is ours. We will not let the Romans take Alesia. We will stand and we will fight no matter the cost." The room fell silent, the weight of Vercingetorix's words sinking in. The commanders nodded, their faces set with grim determination. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that they could not afford to give up. The fate of their people rested on their shoulders, and they would fight until the end. Chapter 2. Caesar's Siege. Julius Caesar stood at the center of his camp, surrounded by his officers. The camp buzzed with activity as legionnaires moved to and fro, preparing for the coming siege. Caesar's face was calm, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the preparations. He had come too far, fought too many battles to allow a single hilltop town to stand in his way. "The fortifications are almost complete, General," said Labienus, one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants. "The outer circumvallation is secure, and the inner lines are being reinforced. Vercingetorix and his men are trapped. It is only a matter of time." Caesar nodded, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward Alesia. "Vercingetorix is a cunning leader," he said. "He knows the land, and he has the loyalty of his people. But he has made a mistake in choosing to face us here. He believes he can outlast us, that his fortifications and his knowledge of the terrain will save him. But he underestimates the resolve of Rome. We will starve them out, and when they are weak, we will crush them." Labienus hesitated for a moment before speaking. "The Gauls have sent for reinforcements, General. Reports suggest that a large force is gathering to break the siege." Caesar's eyes hardened. "Let them come. We will face them, and we will defeat them. The Gauls fight with passion, but we fight with discipline and purpose. We will build our lines, and we will hold them. Vercingetorix may be the hero of the Gauls, but I am the sword of Rome." He turned to his officers, his voice rising. "Make sure every man knows his place. We will not allow a single breach. The fate of Gaul is at stake, and we will not falter." As the officers dispersed, Caesar looked toward Alesia, his eyes filled with determination. He knew that the battle ahead would be fierce, but he was ready. He had faced countless enemies in his quest to bring Gaul under Roman control, and he would not be stopped now. The siege of Alesia would be his crowning achievement, the final act in his conquest of Gaul. He walked through the camp, his presence commanding respect. Soldiers saluted as he passed, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Caesar paused near the siege engines, watching as the engineers made final adjustments. The massive contraptions loomed over the camp, ready to unleash their fury upon Alesia. "The men know what is at stake, General," Labienus said, rejoining Caesar. "They are prepared to give everything for Rome." Caesar nodded, his gaze unwavering. "And they will. Today, we will show the Gauls the true power of Rome. We will crush their spirit and secure our place in history." As night fell, Caesar gathered his officers around a large map spread out on a wooden table. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows over the parchment, the lines and symbols representing the complex fortifications that surrounded Alesia. "Our lines are strong," Caesar said, his voice steady. "We have built not one, but 2 walls, one to keep Vercingetorix in, and one to keep any reinforcements out. The Gauls think they can break us, but they do not understand the resolve of Rome. We will hold these lines no matter what." Labienus nodded, his eyes scanning the map. "The men are ready, General. We have fortified our positions, and the cavalry is prepared to counter any breakthrough attempts." Caesar's eyes narrowed as he looked at the map. "Good. We must be vigilant. Vercingetorix is a clever adversary, and he will try to exploit any weakness, but we will not give him that opportunity. We will tighten the noose around Alesia until they have no choice but to surrender." Chapter 3. The Struggle for Survival. Days turned into weeks, and the siege of Alesia dragged on. Within the walls of the town, the Gauls grew weary. Food supplies dwindled, and the cries of hungry children echoed through the narrow streets. Vercingetorix moved among his people, offering words of encouragement, his presence a beacon of hope in the midst of despair. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vercingetorix gathered his commanders in the central hall of Alesia. The air was thick with tension, the faces of the men around him etched with worry. "We cannot hold out much longer," said Drustan, his voice filled with frustration. "The people are starving, and morale is fading. If the reinforcements do not arrive soon, we will be forced to surrender." Vercingetorix's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with determination. "We will not surrender," he said firmly. "We have sent word to the tribes, and they will come. They know what is at stake. We must hold on a little longer. Every day we resist is a victory. Every moment we delay Caesar is a blow against Rome." A young warrior named Brennus spoke up, his voice filled with emotion. "My family is among those starving, my lord. I will fight to the last breath, but I fear for them." Vercingetorix placed a hand on Brennus's shoulder. "I know, Brennus. We all have loved ones we wish to protect, but we must remain strong. If we falter now, all that we have fought for will be lost. We fight not just for ourselves, but for the future of Gaul. Our ancestors watch over us, and we must honor their memory by standing firm." The commanders nodded, their resolve strengthened by Vercingetorix's words. Though the situation was dire, they knew they could not afford to give up. The fate of their people rested on their shoulders, and they would fight until the end. Vercingetorix looked at each of his commanders, his eyes filled with determination. "We will find a way," he said. "We must hold on until our kin arrive. Every man, every woman, and every child is counting on us. We cannot fail them." The days dragged on, each one more difficult than the last. The Gauls rationed what little food they had left, and the mood within Alesia grew increasingly grim. Vercingetorix could see the fear in the eyes of his people, the way mothers clutched their children close, their faces gaunt with hunger. He knew that they were reaching their breaking point, but he also knew that they could not afford to give in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vercingetorix stood atop the battlements, looking out over the Roman camp. The fires of the enemy stretched out before him, a sea of orange flickering in the growing darkness. He could see the silhouettes of the Roman soldiers moving among the tents, their armor glinting in the firelight. It was a sight that filled him with both anger and determination. Drustan joined him, his face etched with worry. "The people are growing desperate, my lord. They are asking how much longer we must endure this." Vercingetorix took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving the Roman camp. "We must endure as long as it takes, Drustan. We cannot let Caesar win. If we surrender, everything we have fought for will be lost. The tribes are coming. We just need to hold on a little longer." Drustan nodded, though his expression remained grim. "The men are ready to fight, my lord. They will follow you to the end." Vercingetorix turned to his friend, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And I am grateful for their loyalty. We fight not just for ourselves, but for the future of Gaul. We will stand and we will fight, no matter the cost." Chapter 4. The Gallic Reinforcements. One morning, the sound of distant horns echoed across the hills. The Gauls within Alesia rushed to the battlements, their hearts pounding with hope. In the distance they could see the banners of the Gallic reinforcements, a vast army gathered to break the Roman siege. Cheers erupted from the walls, the people's spirits lifted by the sight of their kin coming to their aid. Vercingetorix stood among them, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and determination. He turned to Drustan, who was by his side. "Our brothers have come," he said, his voice thick with emotion. We are not alone in this fight. Together, we can drive Caesar back. Drustan's eyes glistened with relief. It is a sight for sore eyes, my lord. The tribes have answered our call. Now we have a chance. Vercingetorix nodded, his heart swelling with renewed determination. He raised his voice, addressing the people of Alesia. Our kin have come to our aid. We will fight with them side by side, and we will show Caesar that Gaul will not be conquered so easily. Stand strong, my friends. The day of our victory draws near. The people cheered, their voices echoing across the hills. They watched as the Gallic reinforcements advanced, ready to take on the Romans and break the siege. Hope surged through the defenders of Alesia, their spirits lifted by the sight of their allies. But Caesar was prepared. From his vantage point in the Roman camp, he watched the approaching Gallic army with a steely gaze. He knew that this was the moment of truth. The reinforcements would either break his lines or be broken themselves, and the outcome would determine the fate of Gaul. Labienus, Caesar called, his voice calm, despite the tension in the air. Prepare the men. The Gauls are coming to break the siege, but they will find that we are ready for them. We will hold our lines and crush them, just as we have crushed every other force that has dared to stand against Rome. Labienus saluted, his face set in determination. It will be done, General. The men are ready, and we will not allow a single breach. Caesar nodded, his eyes fixed on the advancing banners of the Gallic reinforcements. This is the moment, Labienus. The fate of Gaul rests on what happens here today. We must be strong, and we must be relentless. The Gauls fight for their freedom, but we fight for the glory of Rome. The Romans moved swiftly, reinforcing their lines and preparing for the impending clash. The air was thick with anticipation, both sides knowing that the coming battle would decide the outcome of the siege. Vercingetorix watched from the battlements, his heart pounding as he saw the Gallic reinforcements engage the Roman lines. The clash of weapons and the cries of battle filled the air, the ground trembling beneath the weight of the struggle. He could see the courage of his people, the way they fought with everything they had, but he could also see the discipline of the Roman soldiers, their formations holding firm against the onslaught. Drustan joined him, his face filled with both hope and fear. They are fighting bravely, my lord, but the Romans are well prepared. Vercingetorix clenched his jaw, his eyes never leaving the battlefield. We must believe in them, Drustan. They have come to save us, and we must do everything we can to support them. Ready the men, we will make our move when the time is right. Drustan nodded, his eyes shining with determination. Yes, my lord, we will be ready. As the battle raged on, the Gallic reinforcements pushed against the Roman lines, their courage and determination driving them forward. But the Romans were relentless, their discipline and training allowing them to hold their ground. The clash between the two forces was fierce, neither side willing to give an inch. Vercingetorix knew that this was their moment. He turned to his commanders, his voice filled with urgency. The time is now. We must strike while the Romans are engaged. We will join our brothers and break through their lines. For Gaul! The Gauls within Alesia erupted in cheers, their spirits lifted by Vercingetorix's words. They gathered their weapons, their hearts filled with hope as they prepared to join the battle. The gates of Alesia opened, and the warriors surged forward, their voices echoing across the battlefield as they charged toward the Roman lines. The clash was intense, the Gauls fighting with everything they had, their determination driving them forward. The Romans, caught between the two Gallic forces, fought fiercely to hold their ground. The air was filled with the sound of clashing swords, the cries of the wounded, and the roar of battle. But Caesar had anticipated this move. He had held a reserve of his best legionnaires, and now he unleashed them, their disciplined ranks moving to reinforce the beleaguered Roman lines. The Gauls, already weary from the prolonged siege, began to falter under the renewed assault. Vercingetorix fought at the front, his sword flashing in the sunlight as he urged his people on. "For Gaul! For freedom!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the din of battle. But even as he fought, he could see the tide turning against them. The Romans were too strong, their discipline and numbers overwhelming the exhausted Gauls. Druid fought by his side, his face set with grim determination. "We cannot hold, my lord. There are too many Romans." Vercingetorix's heart ached as he looked around at his people, their faces filled with fear and desperation. He knew that they had given everything, that they had fought with all their strength, but it was not enough. The Romans were closing in, and the fate of Alesia was sealed. Chapter 5. The Surrender of Alesia. The following morning the sun rose over a battlefield, strewn with the fallen. The cries of the wounded echoed across the hills, a haunting reminder of the cost of war. Vercingetorix stood before his people, his head held high despite the weight of defeat that pressed down upon him. He knew what he had to do. He turned to Druid, his voice steady. "Gather the people. I will go to Caesar. It is time to end this." Druid's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded. "You are a true leader, Vercingetorix. Your courage will not be forgotten." Vercingetorix took a deep breath, his heart heavy as he made his way through the streets of Alesia. The people watched in silence, their eyes filled with sorrow and gratitude. He had led them with strength and courage, and now he would sacrifice himself to save them. As he approached the Roman camp, he was met by a group of legionnaires who escorted him to Caesar's tent. The Roman general stood waiting, his expression unreadable as Vercingetorix entered. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, one the conqueror, the other the defeated. Vercingetorix knelt before Caesar, his voice steady as he spoke. "I am Vercingetorix, leader of the Gauls. I surrender to you, Julius Caesar, in the hope that you will show mercy to my people." Caesar regarded him for a long moment, his eyes cold. He had won, and the fate of Gaul was now in his hands. "You fought bravely, Vercingetorix," he said finally, "but Rome does not forget those who resist her. Your people will be spared, but you will face the consequences of your defiance." Vercingetorix nodded, his heart heavy but his spirit unbroken. He had done what he could for his people, and though he would not live to see it, he knew that the spirit of Gaul would endure. He had fought for their freedom, and his name would be remembered as a symbol of resistance against tyranny. The mystical Druid resistance. Chapter 1. The Sacred Grove. The grove was silent, save for the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. In the center of the grove stood a tall figure, his robes of white blending with the dappled sunlight. His name was Eocade, the High Druid, a man whose wisdom was as deep as the forest itself. Around him, other Druids gathered, their faces solemn as they looked to their leader for guidance. "The Romans are advancing," Eocade began, his voice low but carrying a weight that commanded attention. "They bring their roads, their cities, and their laws. They seek to tame the land, to strip it of its spirit. But we are the keepers of this land, and we will not let it be conquered." A murmur of agreement passed through the gathered Druids. Among them stood Kalia, a young druidess whose eyes burned with fierce determination. "We have the power of the earth on our side," she said, her voice clear. "The Romans may have their legions, but they do not understand the magic of this land. We must use our knowledge, our connection to the earth, to resist them." Eocade nodded, his eyes meeting Kalia's. "You speak true, Kalia. The power of the earth is strong, but it requires sacrifice. The Romans are relentless, and they will not stop until they have taken everything. We must be prepared to fight, not just with our magic, but with our hearts and our courage." The Druids fell silent, each of them feeling the weight of Eochaid's words. They knew that the days ahead would be difficult, that the Romans were a force unlike any they had faced before, but they also knew that they could not stand by and watch as their sacred lands were destroyed. They would fight, and they would do so with every ounce of strength they possessed. Eochaid raised his staff, the tip adorned with a cluster of sacred mistletoe, and spoke once more, his voice resonating with conviction. "Tonight we will perform the rite of protection. We will call upon the spirits of our ancestors, and we will fortify this land with our magic. The Romans may bring their swords and their shields, but we have the power of the earth itself. Gather what you need, for tonight we stand as one, united in our purpose." The Druids dispersed, moving silently through the grove, each one preparing for the ritual ahead. Kalia lingered, her eyes fixed on Eochaid. "Do you truly believe we can hold them off?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eochaid turned to her, his gaze steady. "I believe in the power of this land, Kalia. The Romans may think they can conquer us, but they do not understand the spirit of our people. As long as we stand together, we have a chance." Kalia nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, but she was ready to face whatever came. For the land, for her people, and for the sacred grove that had always been their sanctuary. Chapter 2. The Roman Advance. Julius Sabinus, a Roman commander, stood at the edge of the forest, his eyes scanning the dense woods before him. The trees loomed like giants, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. The forest was unlike anything he had seen before, dark, mysterious, and filled with an unsettling sense of being watched. Sabinus turned to his second-in-command, a seasoned centurion named Marcus. "The Druids are in there," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of determination and unease. "Our scouts have reported strange occurrences, men disappearing, traps that seem to spring from nowhere. These Druids are not like any enemy we have faced. They use the forest itself against us." Marcus nodded, his face set in a grim expression. "The men are on edge, sir. They say the forest is haunted, that the Druids command spirits to do their bidding." Sabinus frowned, his jaw tightening. "Spirits or not, we have our orders. The Emperor wants this land, and we will take it. The Druids are using fear against us, but we are Roman soldiers. We do not yield to superstition. Prepare the men. We move at dawn." The centurion saluted and turned to relay the orders, leaving Sabinus to stare into the depths of the forest. He could not deny the sense of unease that gripped him, the feeling that they were stepping into something far greater than themselves, but he pushed the thought aside. They were Romans, and they would not be deterred by shadows and whispers. As night fell, the Roman camp settled into an uneasy silence. The soldiers huddled around their campfires, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The forest loomed around them, an impenetrable wall of darkness. The men spoke in hushed tones, sharing stories of strange sights and sounds, glimpses of figures moving between the trees, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Marcus approached Sabinus, his expression grim. "The men are restless, Commander. They fear what lies within the forest. Some say they have seen shadows moving, heard voices that do not belong to any of us." Sabinus clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. "Fear is a weapon the Druids use against us. We must not give in to it. Tomorrow we will march into that forest, and we will root them out. Remind the men that they are soldiers of Rome. We do not yield to fear." Marcus nodded, though the unease in his eyes remained. He turned and walked away, leaving Sabinus to stare into the darkness. The commander could not shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far beyond their understanding, but he knew that they had no choice. The emperor had ordered the conquest of this land, and he would see it done, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. The Power of the Forest. As dawn broke, the Roman legions moved into the forest, their shields held high, their swords ready. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves sending a ripple of unease through the ranks. The Druids watched from the shadows, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They knew that this was the moment they had been preparing for. Yochai stood at the edge of the sacred grove, his eyes closed as he whispered a prayer to the spirits of the forest. "Great spirits of the earth, hear our call. Protect this land, protect your children, guide our hands and give us strength." Beside him, Caelia knelt, her hands pressed against the earth. She could feel the power of the land beneath her, the pulse of life that ran through the roots of the trees, through the soil and the stones. It was a power that was ancient, far older than the Romans who now sought to conquer it. The Druids began to chant, their voices rising in unison, a haunting melody that seemed to blend with the rustling of the leaves and the calls of the birds. The ground beneath the Roman soldiers began to tremble, the roots of the trees twisting and writhing as if alive. The soldiers stumbled, their formation breaking as they tried to keep their footing. Sabinus watched in disbelief as the forest seemed to come alive around them. Trees swayed, their branches reaching down like grasping hands, while the ground beneath their feet shifted and buckled. "Hold the line!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Do not let them break you!" But the forest was relentless. Vines shot out from the underbrush, wrapping around the legs of the soldiers, pulling them to the ground. The Druids moved among the trees, their robes blending with the shadows, their eyes filled with fierce determination. They struck quickly, using the element of surprise to their advantage, their knowledge of the forest allowing them to move unseen. Caelia moved with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, her staff in hand as she struck at the Roman soldiers. She could feel the power of the earth flowing through her, guiding her movements, giving her strength. She knew that they could not hold the Romans back forever, but they could make them pay dearly for every step they took. The cries of the Romans echoed through the forest, their disciplined ranks struggling against an enemy they could not see. The Druids moved like phantoms, striking and disappearing before the soldiers could react. Sabinus fought to keep his men together, his voice hoarse from shouting orders, but the forest was against them, and the Druids fought with a fury that seemed to come from the earth itself. Chapter 4. The Cost of Resistance. The battle raged on, the forest echoing with the sounds of clashing swords, the cries of the wounded, and the chants of the Druids. The Romans fought with discipline, their training allowing them to hold their ground despite the chaos around them. But the Druids fought with a fierceness that came from knowing that they were fighting for their home, for their way of life. Eochaid moved among his people, his presence a source of strength and reassurance. He could see the exhaustion in their faces, the way their movements were beginning to slow. The power of the forest was great, but it was not limitless. And the Druids were beginning to feel the strain of their efforts. He turned to Caelia, who was fighting nearby, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "We must fall back," he called to her, his voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "We cannot hold them here. We must protect the sacred grove." Caelia's eyes filled with tears, her heart breaking at the thought of retreating. "But if we fall back, they will take the forest," she said, her voice trembling. "Everything we have fought for will be lost." Eochaid placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with compassion. "The forest is more than just the trees, Kalia. It is the spirit of our people, and that spirit cannot be conquered. We will live to fight another day. The Romans may take this land, but they will never take our hearts." Reluctantly, Kalia nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and determination. She raised her staff, her voice ringing out over the chaos. "Fall back! To the grove! We must protect the sacred grove!" The Druids began to retreat, their movements swift and coordinated. They moved through the forest like shadows, disappearing into the underbrush, their knowledge of the land allowing them to evade the pursuing Romans. Sabinus watched as the Druids vanished, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and frustration. They had won the battle, but he knew that the war was far from over. As the Druids retreated, they moved with a heavy heart, knowing that the sacred land they cherished was being trampled by the Romans. The forest, once filled with magic and serenity, was now marred by the scars of battle. Kalia glanced back, her eyes lingering on the destruction. She clenched her fists, vowing that they would return, that they would not let this be their end. Chapter 5. The Sacred Grove Defended. The Druids gathered in the sacred grove, their faces etched with exhaustion and sorrow. They had fought bravely, but they knew that the Romans would not stop until they had taken everything. Eochaid stood in the center of the grove, his eyes closed as he reached out to the spirits of the forest, his heart filled with a desperate plea. "Great spirits, we have done all that we can. We ask for your protection, for your guidance. Help us to defend this sacred place, to keep the heart of the forest from falling into the hands of those who would destroy it." The air around them seemed to grow still, the leaves no longer rustling, the birds no longer calling. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting, listening. Slowly, a sense of calm began to settle over the grove, a feeling of peace that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Kalia looked to Eochaid, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "What do we do now, my lord?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eochaid opened his eyes, his gaze steady. "We wait, Kalia. The Romans may come, but they will not find an easy victory here. The forest is with us, and as long as we draw breath, we will not allow this place to fall. We are the keepers of the old ways, and we will fight until our last breath to protect what is sacred." The Druids nodded, their resolve strengthened by Eochaid's words. They knew that the days ahead would be difficult, that they would face challenges unlike any they had known before, but they also knew that they were not alone. The spirits of the forest were with them, and as long as they stood together, they would continue to resist. As night fell, the Druids gathered around a fire in the center of the grove. They sang songs of their ancestors, their voices rising into the night sky, a tribute to the spirits of the land. The flames flickered, casting shadows on the standing stones that encircled the grove, their ancient symbols glowing in the firelight. Eochaid spoke, his voice carrying over the crackling of the fire. "This grove is our heart, our sanctuary. The Romans may have taken much from us, but they will never take our spirit. We will continue to fight, to protect what is sacred. The forest is alive, and as long as we believe, it will protect us." Kalia looked around at her fellow Druids, their faces illuminated by the firelight. She could see the weariness in their eyes, but also the determination. They had lost much, but they still had each other, and they still had the sacred grove. The battle was far from over, but they would not give up. They were the keepers of the old ways, and they would fight until the end.